We need to get out of here quickly.
Oh, because of the night out. I know, but where do we go? These are the noodles, and this is the seasoning that I'm gonna put in it.
I was just thinking about that trip we took last year.
Oh, the one to the mountains. That was fun.
Did you hear what happened down the street?
No, what happened?
Yeah. There was a big argument.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how long it's gonna take me to get there.
The landslide happened so quickly, we were lucky to get out of the way.
I know, it was really scary. Are you okay?
I've always cherished the simple beauty of these fields, a legacy passed down through generations.
Are you okay?
I think I twisted my ankle.
I'm just gonna lie down for a bit.
Are you feeling all right, Mom?
I've been thinking about what you said.
And what have you decided?
Bunch years rowing, and I love talking about things that are close to my heart.
It's a difficult situation, but we must persevere for our children.
The world did not open with calmness, but with a sudden crack of frailty, as if the air itself whispered of impending misfortune. It began with the trembling steps of an old mother, her fragile frame bent by years of toil and sacrifice, her eyes carrying the weight of generations, and yet her heart always beating not for herself, but for her children. The morning was heavy with rain, the sky dark and swollen with storm clouds, and she moved slowly through the damp earth, carrying in her heart a mission that only a mother could embrace. Her daughter-in-law was sick. The medicine that was supposed to ease her pain had run out, and so the old mother, in her stubborn devotion, decided that she herself would go and find more. Her back throbbed with a constant ache. Her legs screamed with every step, but she told herself that love was stronger than pain and duty stronger than weakness. She entered the grove where the wild plants grew, the roots tangled deep in the soil, her breath shuddering with effort, her hands clutching a crooked stick as support, and still she pressed forward until her eyes spotted the stubborn root. It was the one she believed could heal her child, and she reached upward, stretching her thin arms like branches against the storm. Her fingers clawed at the earth and bark until the ground betrayed her. She slipped once and then again, rolling down the slope like a rag doll, her back striking stone, her legs twisting in unnatural ways, her screams swallowed by the forest. The world spun into dizziness, but she did not stop, for mothers never stop. She clawed again at the dirt, pain shooting up her spine and legs until she could barely breathe. Yet she whispered to herself that her daughter-in-law needed her, and she must bring the medicine back. When at last the forest released her, she crawled toward a makeshift tent, shivering through the night, her body trembling with exhaustion, her breath shallow. By dawn, she dragged herself home, her clothes torn, her skin raw, but in her eyes burned the quiet fire of someone who would never surrender to age. Her daughter cried out in fear at the sight of her broken figure, and the son-in-law rushed to lift her, holding her as if she were glass about to shatter. They brought her into the house, laid her upon the mat, and surrounded her with worry. They cooked rice for her, steaming with warmth. They They brought medicine to her lips, and they massaged her aching legs with careful hands. Their voices carried the weight of fear, reminding her that she must rest, but she only smiled faintly, as if to say that a mother's work is never done. Outside, the storm battered the roof, but within the home, the family clung to one another like frightened birds, protecting their wounded guardian. Yet the old mother, though grateful for their care, could not silence the restless stir within her chest. Days passed, and while the son-in-law and daughter worked the fields, driving stakes into the soil, preparing nets to protect the crops, she sat within the house, her body aching but her mind restless. She stared at the door as if beyond it waited answers to questions she had never dared to ask. For in her heart lay the memory of a shadow, whispers of another child, one lost, one never returned, and though she had raised her son with devotion, she could never escape the absence that haunted her bones. So when the chance came, she rose quietly, leaning on her cane, each step a battle, each breath a hiss of pain. She opened the door and stepped into the rain without a word, the house behind her unaware that she was gone. The road stretched before her, slick with water, silver veins cutting through the land, and she followed it, guided not by reason but by instinct. Somewhere beyond the horizon, she believed there was a face she must find, a truth buried deep in silence. Her legs protested with agony, her back screamed for rest, but still she pressed forward, muttering prayers to the ancestors. At the house, the daughter returned from the fields and found the mat empty. Her heart froze. She called out through the rooms, into the kitchen, into every corner, but no answer came. She ran to the son-in-law, her breath frantic, her voice breaking. He dropped the tools from his hands, and together they searched the house, the pond, the path circling the fields. They shouted her name into the storm, but the rain swallowed their cries. Neighbors shook their heads, worry spreading like fire through the village. The son-in-law, drenched in rain, clutched the phone with trembling fingers, his voice shaking as he said, "She is gone. She is gone. And I do not know where she went." The daughter wept, asking why she would leave them without a word, why she would cause such fear. The son-in-law, his jaw clenched, swore he would find her. Meanwhile, the old mother walked deeper into the village, her cane tapping like a heartbeat against the stones. She asked strangers if they had seen a wedding, if they knew of a family with a son-in-law, her questions vague, her voice trembling. And then she saw him, the young man whose face mirrored her son's, whose eyes carried a resemblance that made her heart falter. She whispered, "You look like him. You look like my son, like two brothers cut from the same cloth." The young man stiffened, denied her words, insisted she was mistaken. But she saw the fear in his eyes, the way his lips trembled, and she pressed harder. He pulled away, refused to answer, and fled into the storm. She stood alone in the rain, her tears mixing with water, whispering that truth would not hide forever. At home, the daughter clung to her husband, sobbing that her mother was gone, fearing she had fallen, fearing she would never return. The son-in-law clenched his fists, his mind racing, and he ran toward the old family home, believing she might have gone there. But it was empty, silence mocking him. He shouted her name into the walls, but only echoes replied. Despair threatened to crush him, yet he pressed on, for love gave him strength. And when at last he returned, his face pale, his clothes torn, he found her sitting once more on the mat, her body trembling with exhaustion but her eyes calm. She whispered, "Forgive me. I only went out for a little while. I did not mean to worry you." Tears filled the room. The daughter cried that she must never leave without telling them again, and the son-in-law, silent but fierce with emotion, vowed that he would not let her slip away again. The old mother lowered her head, ashamed, whispering that she would remember next time. But even as the storm outside eased, inside the house lingered a shadow, the memory of the young man, the unanswered questions, and the truth still waiting to be unearthed. Night came, but it did not bring rest. It carried only a restless trembling that settled into the bones of the house, as if the wooden beams themselves groaned under the weight of unspoken fears. The daughter and the son-in-law tried to remain calm, whispering soft words to reassure the old mother, who now lay on the mat, her eyes closed but her mind far from sleep. Though she had promised to stay, though she had whispered apologies for the worry she had caused, her heart refused to quiet. The image of the young man burned behind her eyelids, a ghost carved from her own blood, and no matter how much exhaustion pulled her down, she could not silence the suspicion that fate had placed a truth before her. The daughter, watching her mother's frail chest rise and fall, whispered to her husband. She said she feared her mother was hiding something strong enough to drive her to leave again without a word. The son-in-law placed his hand upon her shoulder, his jaw firm. He answered that the old mother carried secrets from the past, and perhaps they would never understand them. Still, she was their mother, and they must protect her, even from herself. Their voices were low, but the old mother heard every word. She wanted to explain, to confess the storm that churned inside her heart, but she held her tongue. How could she speak of lost children, of shadows without proof? How could she burden her daughter with pain that had lived so long in silence? Morning arrived with pale light slipping through the mist. The fields glistened with dew, and the son-in-law prepared to return to work. His hands were rough from planting stakes, his back sore from labor, but his mind remained heavy with worry. Before leaving, he knelt beside the old mother and begged her to stay in the house. He told her they could not endure the fear of losing her again. She nodded and promised, but promises mean little when the heart burns with questions. When the house grew quiet, she rose. Her body trembled. Each step was heavy, each breath a struggle. Yet her determination burned brighter than her pain. She slipped from the house, her cane tapping softly against the earth, and moved toward the village. She told herself she would not go far, that she only needed to see the young man again, the one whose face mirrored her son's so completely. The path wound before her like a serpent, the clouds heavy above. She asked strangers about weddings, about families, about sons who had taken brides, but the answers were vague and dismissive. The villagers shook their heads, confused by her persistence. Still, she pressed on. At last, she saw him. The young man stood near the roadside, speaking with others. Her heart pounded, her hands shook. She approached him, her voice a trembling whisper. She told him that he looked like her son, that he could be a brother, cut from the same cloth. His eyes widened, his shoulders stiffened, and once again he denied it. He told her she was mistaken, that she should leave him alone. But she saw through his words. She saw fear trembling on his lips, heard the crack in his voice. She pressed harder, asking who his parents were, asking why he faltered at such simple questions. His face went pale, his fists clenched, his breath uneven. At last, anger overtook his fear. He shouted that he was not who she thought, that his parents were his real parents, and that she should never follow him again. Then he turned and ran, his footsteps echoing down the wet road. The old mother tried to follow, but her legs betrayed her. Pain roared up her spine, and she collapsed against a wall, her breath shallow, her vision blurring. She whispered into the rain that truth would not hide forever. When she finally returned home, soaked and trembling, the daughter burst into tears. She scolded her mother, crying that she was tearing the family apart with her disappearances. The son-in-law stood silent, his eyes filled with both fear and anger. He told her that if she carried a truth, she must share it because they deserved to understand. The old mother lowered her gaze. She wanted to tell them, but words failed. Instead, she wept in silence, carrying her burden alone. The days that followed were heavy with unease. The family worked in the fields, the fences half built, the nets stretched across the garden. Yet even as they labored, they glanced back toward the house, fearing at any moment she might vanish again. the daughter began to dream of her mother walking into the rain and never returning. The son-in-law began to live in a state of constant vigilance, his heart hardening with dread. And the old mother, though her body ached and her legs quivered like brittle branches, could not still the fire within her. She whispered to herself that she must know the truth, even if it destroyed her. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in fading gold, she sat outside the house. Her cane lay across her knees, her eyes fixed on the road. She whispered into the gathering dark that if the young man was truly her blood, she would not rest until the truth came to light. Inside, the daughter watched her mother and shivered. She could sense something coming, a storm not of rain but of secrets, heavy enough to break them. The son-in-law wrapped an arm around her shoulders and whispered that whatever happened, they would face it together. But even he could not hide the dread in his voice. The next morning, before the sun rose, the old mother pretended to sleep until she heard the daughter and son-in-law leave for the fields. Then she rose again. Each step was agony, every breath sharp, yet her resolve remained unbroken. She walked further than before, deeper into the village, until she found the young man near the market. His eyes darkened with frustration at the sight of her. He muttered that she was haunting him, that she should stop following him. She answered with a trembling voice, yet one sharp as a blade. She told him that she only wanted the truth, that if he was not her blood, then he must tell her without hesitation. He faltered. His lips parted, but no words came. His shoulders shook, and his face grew pale. The old mother stepped closer. Her eyes, though clouded with age, shone fierce and unyielding. She whispered that blood cannot lie, that she saw him for what he was, and that he was her son's brother. The young man broke then. His voice rose in anger, denying her, commanding her to stop. He turned and fled once more, his footsteps loud in the narrow streets. The old mother stumbled after him, her cane striking the ground, her body fighting against her will. She fell to her knees, clawing forward, whispering that he must not run, that truth could not remain buried. The world spun around her, black and unsteady, and she collapsed in the mud. When she awoke, she was back in the house. Villagers had carried her there, her daughter kneeling at her side, her son-in-law standing behind her with eyes full of fire. The daughter sobbed that her mother was destroying herself, that she would not survive another search. The son-in-law's voice was rough, but his fear was clear. He begged her to let them help, to stop carrying this burden alone. But the old mother turned her face away. In a trembling voice, she whispered that it was her burden, her sin, and her truth to uncover. Silence fell over the house, heavy as stone. Each of them knew the storm was not yet over. Each of them knew the truth was close, like thunder waiting on the horizon. And when it struck, none of them would remain untouched. The final days pressed upon the house like a heavy weight, each moment stretched by fear and silence. The daughter and the son-in-law watched the old mother with restless eyes, afraid that at any instant she would slip away again. The old mother sat by the window, her cane resting across her lap, her gaze fixed far beyond the fields, where the horizon glowed with the fading fire of sunset. Within her chest burned a fire that pain could not extinguish, for she could not forget the young man, nor the resemblance that had struck her heart like lightning. That night, when the house grew quiet, she rose once more. Her steps were slow, her breath shallow, but her will stronger than the frailty of her body. She left the house and walked under the pale moonlight. The road stretched before her, silver and wet with dew, and the trees whispered like witnesses to her determination. At the market, she found him again, standing alone beneath a flickering lamp. She called to him, her voice sharp with desperation. He turned, his eyes tired, his shoulders tense, and he demanded to know why she continued to torment him. The old mother's voice trembled, yet it cut through the air with clarity. She told him that truth mattered more than her bones, more than her breath. She told him that he carried the face of her son, that blood itself cried out through his features. If she was wrong, he should end it, tell her clearly, and give her peace. He faltered. His lips opened, but no words came. His fists clenched, his chest heaved, and in that silence she knew her heart had not deceived her. He was hiding something. She stepped closer, her frail hand extended not to seize him, but to offer. She whispered that if he was lost, he deserved to be found. If he was hers, he deserved to be loved. His eyes filled with tears, his voice cracked, but anger drowned his fear. He shouted that he had parents, that they were his real family, and that she should leave him alone. Then he turned and fled into the night. The old mother tried to follow. Her cane struck the stones, her legs dragged behind her, her back screamed in pain. She stumbled and fell, her palms tearing against the ground. Yet she clawed forward, whispering that he must not run, that truth could not remain buried. Darkness spun around her, and she collapsed. At dawn, the villagers found her, frail and broken, and carried her home. The daughter cried out, clutching her mother's hand, begging her to live. The son-in-law stood pale, his fists trembling, fear carved into his face. Through shallow breaths, the old mother whispered fragments of her truth. Long ago, she had lost a child. Long ago, fate had stolen someone from her arms. She had buried the pain in silence, but when she saw the young man, she knew the past had returned. The daughter trembled, torn between sorrow and compassion. She whispered that if the truth existed, they must seek it together. The son-in-law nodded, his voice low but steady, and promised that they would face it as a family. Tears filled the old mother's eyes, and she whispered yes, together. The next day, despite her weakness, she insisted on going back. With her daughter at her side and her son-in-law supporting her, she returned to the village. They found the young man once more. He tried to turn away, but the three of them stood before him. The old mother spoke gently this time. She told him she was not there to take him away, not to steal him from the family who had raised him. She only wanted to know if blood bound them, if fate had given her back what it had once taken. The young man shook his head, muttering that she was mistaken, that she could not understand. His words stumbled, his eyes burned with fear, and at last his voice broke. He whispered that his parents had told him he was adopted, that they had never spoken of where he came from. He confessed he had never known who his true family was. The old mother gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her heart broke and healed at the same time. She reached for him, her frail arms trembling, and pulled him close. She whispered again and again, "My child, my child." The daughter cried openly, whispering that if he was her brother, then he was part of their family too. The son-in-law placed a steady hand upon the young man's shoulder, welcoming him without words. The young man wept, torn between the life he had lived and the truth that now pulsed within his veins. For the first time, he felt both lost and found. The old mother held him tighter, whispering that he belonged, that he was not alone. In the days that followed, he visited their home often, at first shy, at first unsure, but slowly with more ease. The daughter treated him as family. The son-in-law accepted him as a brother. The old mother, though weaker each day, carried within her a peace she had long been denied, for she had uncovered the truth, and she had given her children the gift of knowing they were not alone. One evening, as the sun sank golden over the fields, the family gathered around a simple meal. The aroma of rice and herbs filled the air, and laughter, fragile but real, warmed the house. The old mother looked at them all, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. She whispered softly that she could finally rest, for her family was whole again. Her daughter grasped her hand, the son-in-law bowed his head, and the young man's eyes filled with tears. Outside, the wind carried the scent of soil and rain, the fields breathing with life. Inside, the house no longer trembled with fear, but hummed with fragile peace. The old mother closed her eyes, a faint smile on her lips. She had walked through pain, through shadows, through storms of doubt, but in the end she had brought her family together. And though tomorrow might bring new struggles, tonight At last they were whole, and the world felt at peace.